So basically, this section is going to talk about what is the responsibility of the state DOT in administering your funds, especially at the local level. So if you have local projects at the local level, what are your responsibilities for ensuring that those funds are still spent and still the projects are still performed in accordance with the terms and conditions of the federal award and all of the other federal requirements. So we're going to talk about what that relationship is between federal highway law and the state law and guidance and 2 CFR 200. We'll talk about stewardship and oversight specifically because Federal Highway Administration has very specific stewardship and oversight guidelines. Then we'll also talk about 23 USC 106, which basically is our law that outlines what that stewardship and oversight is all about. And then we're going to talk about in 2 CFR 200 the very specific requirements that are addressed for pass-through entities. If you provide funds to a local government, which you do, to an MPO, then you have certain responsibilities you have to follow as a pass-through entity. So ultimately, federal highway, we're held accountable to Congress. You know, Congress passes our laws, and the federal agencies are held accountable for the funds that we administer, that we provide to the state DOTs. So ultimately, we're held responsible for the efficient, effective, and compliance use of our funds, and they have to be consistent with the laws, regulations, and policies. But we all know that this is a state-administered program. So how do we ensure that the state DOTs are in compliance? So you all have to have this same mindset as we do, because ultimately you're administering the funds with federal highway oversight, so you have to ensure also that the funds are spent efficiently and effectively and in accordance with the laws and regulations. So what's stewardship mean? So stewardship is the efficient, effective, and compliant management of public dollars, public funds. These are taxpayer dollars, you know, fuel taxes, still taxpayer dollars, public dollars. So we want to make sure that we're using these funds for the appropriate reasons, for reasonable activities. And so we need to make sure that we have good stewardship of those funds. I'm sure people have heard of being a good steward of the public dollar. That's what this means. So what are stewardship activities? Basically, these are things that Federal Highway Administration does, but these are also things that the state DOTs do. So leadership of the program. Of course, Federal Highway Administration, we're the federal agency, the federal awarding agency, so we lead that, but the state DOTs, you lead it in the state of Oklahoma. I mean, you are the leaders of the transportation program here in Oklahoma. Technology deployment is another stewardship activity. I think Laura mentioned it earlier, Everyday Counts. That's a big technology type of initiative that Federal Highway uses, and the state DOTs, you all implement that program throughout the country. And once we've identified, you know, some maybe usable deployment or technologically advanced types of activities, those things could become best practices and become regular types of activities that you might do in your states. Technical assistance, that's like one of my primary jobs in my job at the resource centers. We provide technical assistance and training. But the division offices, that's one of the unique things with Federal Highway is we have a division in every single state. So that division office can be there to help the state DOT and the other transportation partners that we have in Oklahoma, and we have a dedicated staff that's very specifically working just in Oklahoma. And in my position, we support the whole country. So we support the division offices, we support the state DOTs and our other transportation partners, and then we also support our headquarters. So the resource center, we kind of, you know, touch everybody and work with everybody. Problem solving, you know, if there's ever a question or an issue, you can always reach out to the division, and then if the division can't answer the question, we can run it up the chain to get, you know, a decision from our headquarters program offices if need be. Then, of course, program administration, that's one of the biggest things. You have programs here, and when we talk about programs, we're not talking specifically about projects. We're talking more of like programs like civil rights program, your infrastructure program, your safety program. So these big overarching kind of programs, you administer those programs, and we also have our program offices that basically write all the policy, contribute to the legislative and the regulatory types of activities that Congress does. In my new position, I've been there for 1 week, and I work in I'm the team lead for the financial management and policy team, and I've already learned, just in the 1 week that I've worked there last week, this is my second week, which I asked them, hey, can I still go do Oklahoma really quick, because it was kind of a last minute deal, so they let me come here. But one of the big things I've seen is they get technical assistance requests from the Hill, from Capitol Hill. So like one of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee is asking a question about transportation alternatives, and they push it down to my office, and we have experts on our team that basically answer those questions and respond back to Congress. So we provide that program administration and the technical assistance, even up to the Congress and Senate. And then oversight, that's another big activity, part of stewardship, and we're going to talk about what those oversight activities are as well. Just as an FYI, you might see this in a question. It's going to ask you about stewardship activities versus oversight activities, and we're going to talk about oversight here in a second. So the big thing on stewardship, and this kind of goes right into our stewardship and oversight guidelines, is we can't look at every single project, every single transaction that happens, and even the state, you can't look at every single activity that's going on in a project in detail to make sure that it's in compliance. So what we say is the states, you are going to assume responsibilities on behalf of Federal Highway, so we're not going to make certain decisions. In the past, if you were doing a construction project, you'd develop a plan, specs, and estimates document, and that had to go to the division office for actual review and approval before you could start that project. That doesn't happen anymore. Most of the time now it's like, hey, the states get to approve your PS&Es. The Federal Highway Administration really doesn't have any say or sign off on most of them. Now, we do have things called PODs, or projects of division interest, where maybe the division does say, hey, we want to look at your PS&E document. But for the most part, I would say 99% of our program, we let the states do that. So we trust that you know what the rules are. We trust to make sure that you are going to implement the program the way it's supposed to be, but then we have to verify. And that's using a risk-based approach. So we're not going to be able to look at everything, but we're going to go out and say, hey, let's pull some transactions in a particular area, topic area maybe, and let's drill down and just make sure that everything's working the way it's supposed to work. So we do a trust but verify, and we use a risk-based approach when we're doing that verification. Then our construction people wanted me to add this bullet, be in responsible charge. And the reason why, and it may not be too much of an issue here because you guys don't do as much local projects, but we've seen oftentimes where a small local government, they have a staff engineer, but that staff engineer really isn't staff. They're a consultant that they hire to do the engineering work for the local government, but they're actually still a consultant. They're not a public employee. They're not, a city engineer. They're a consultant that they hire to do that, and that's okay. We're not saying that's not correct. What we're saying, though, is if they are not a public employee, they cannot be in responsible charge for local projects. It has to be a public official. So even if you're in a small local community and all you have is a consultant engineer, whoever the highest ranking public employee is has the overall responsibility. They can rely on that engineer to do the engineering stuff. A mayor may not be familiar with construction or be an engineer. So they may not be able to understand everything, and they can rely on their consultant, but ultimately that consultant can't make decisions on behalf of the local public agency because they're not truly a public employee. So that's basically what that says, and it's very specific to construction. So 23 CFR 635 is our regulations for construction. So we've talked about stewardship, so now let's talk about oversight. What are those oversight activities that we do to make sure that we have good stewardship of the federal dollars? So what we do is, and this is both at the Federal Highway Administration and this should also happen at the state DOT, we do project inspections. So you have engineers that go out and might check the work of the contractor, make sure things are going along the schedule that it's supposed to be on, that we're not seeing too many overruns, that we're not seeing a bunch of changes, and those are the types of activities that you might do for oversight. Federal Highway Administration, I know a lot of times division engineers will go out and look at, do spot checks on projects, see how things are going along. Certifications. We have very specific certifications for certain things, you know, Buy America certification, right-of-way certification. So those are very specific certifications that you have to do to basically say that you're ready to move on to the next phase of work, like with right-of-way, or for the Buy America certification that you're certifying, or that the contractor's certifying that the iron and steel that are being incorporated into the project were made in America, manufactured and made in America. And I'm going to talk about Buy America in a little bit more detail in a little bit. Then we have our program and process reviews. This is one of the big things that Federal Highway does a lot, is we have our FIRE program in the finance side, the Financial Integrity and Review and Evaluation program. We have various different reviews that we perform under that, but we also have a lot of program reviews. So there might be a fiscal constraint review or a right-of-way review where maybe we're looking at your manual, your right-of-way manual, because every state is required to have a right-of-way manual. So these are different reviews that we do, and they should also be reviews that you're going to do because that's part of your monitoring. Then we have audits. So those could be internal audits. Most state DOTs have an internal audit group. I'm sure, does Oklahoma have auditors? Yep. So those auditors, they're looking at your internal, you know, internal controls, your internal processes and procedures, looking at costs. They might be auditing consultant agreements. There's a lot of different things that happen on the audit side, but then this also refers to your single audit. So every state DOT is required or is part of the statewide audit or has your own single audit. And if there's findings related to Federal Highway Administration or US DOT, then you're going to have to do some corrective actions, and we're going to have to follow up on that as part of our oversight activities. So our law, 23 USC 106, and you're going to see that quite a bit. You might see it in some questions. But 23 USC section 106, the paragraph we're talking about right now is C3, basically outlines the requirement that there is a stewardship and oversight agreement between the Federal Highway Division Office, so Oklahoma Division, and the Oklahoma DOT. And what that stewardship and oversight agreement basically says is it documents what activities Oklahoma DOT is going to assume on behalf of Federal Highway Administration. So it's going to say, okay, we allow the Oklahoma DOT to approve PS&Es, maybe. Or it'll say, we allow the Oklahoma DOT to approve change orders without going through the division office to get them approved. But does that mean you still have to have authorization? So it's, even though we're not approving the change order or approving the PS&E, there's still an expectation that that shows up in the federal system in FEMAS, where we're authorizing those activities to proceed based on what the rules are. So we're going to talk later about major changes and non-major changes on construction. And yes, we have delegated to the states to determine what a major change is and what a non-major change is, but you still have to follow the rules. If it's a major change, that has to be approved and authorized before you can start work on the project. If it's a non-major change, those can be retroactive. So non-major changes, I'm thinking more like overruns, or maybe you have a certain threshold that you use, like maybe $100,000 or less would be considered a non-major change. And so those things can happen, and you can do them, but you may not have to necessarily have approval in FEMAS before you start doing work on those. But big changes, change orders, design changes, those types of things that really impact the project, you can still approve those. You've assumed those responsibilities, but you can't start working on them until you've modified the project agreement, increased it for whatever that change is, and somebody in the division office has signed off on it. So that's what we're talking about as far as assuming responsibilities. And every state, you can go out to our website, every state has a stewardship and oversight agreement. So you can go out and find every single state's S&O agreement. You can download the Oklahoma one. Do you know when the last time it was written? 2015. So yours is 2015, which that's pretty standard, because I think 2015 was when our headquarters basically mandated, because most of what happened in the past was we did a stewardship and oversight agreement and we never went back and looked at it again. So in 2015, they kind of did a headquarters mandate that everybody look at their stewardship and oversight agreements, and get them updated. Now the recommendation is you should look at them every year or two to see if there's any changes needed. But if leadership changes at the state DOT or in the division office, because they're the two that are signing off on it, I highly recommend reissuing. So if you have a new DOT director and the old DOT director signed the S&O agreement, I would just have the, even if you're not changing anything, just have the new leadership sign off on those. So what do we do in the division offices? So we're talking very specifically the Oklahoma division. So, the Oklahoma division office is pretty much structured, is like a little, not really a DOT, but we have basically folks that support all of the different program areas. We have our engineers that actually go out and are responsible for overseeing the different projects in the districts, or is that what you guys call it, districts here? What's that? Divisions, okay. So you have like your division engineers, but then you might have program engineers, like your safety engineers that are overseeing the safety program, or the bridge engineers and that kind of thing. We have those staff in our division offices. Then, of course, we have our finance folks, we have planners, we have civil rights, administrative. So we have a lot of different disciplines in the division that's there to support the state DOTs. So we go out and we'll do program and process reviews on various different areas. We have our fire program that's very specific to finance. It's led by finance, but a lot of the activities are actually applicable and impact the other disciplines. It's very important for folks to understand when people see fire, they think it's just a financial activity, but it's really not. While it is called financial integrity, everybody has responsibility for financial integrity. Some of the examples like I gave earlier, if your engineers are in the field and you're documenting in your diary, I mean, that is a financial integrity activity because you're documenting that the contractor delivered materials, and we're going to tie that documentation to what we were actually billed for materials, and it should all tie out. So it's important to know that financial integrity is really everybody's responsibility. Compliance assessment program, that is something that's specific in the division offices that are non-finance types of activities. So every division, I believe, and I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, division folks, that you have to do the core every year still, right? So there's a core questionnaire that has to be done, and they're for projects that are selected by our headquarters. So the Oklahoma division doesn't get to pick the projects that they want to look at. Somebody up at our headquarters pushes those down to the division, and you have to do these core questionnaire, and then you can pick the other program types of questionnaires. So there might be a questionnaire on right-of-way if you want to do a more focused compliance assessment on right-of-way, and that's what the division's going to do, and they're going to work with the state DOT to get the information that they need, and then, maybe state DOT folks might even be on the assessment team. It's really up to the divisions on how they do that, but that compliance assessment is basically an assessment of everything but finance, and then fire is really an assessment on the actual financial details. Then I mentioned PODs, but we do have project level oversight per state that a state DOT can choose and a division can choose what are those projects of division interest. So like in Oklahoma, how many PODs do we have? 2? 24 in total? Okay, and how many active projects do you have? No, I'm talking active, all active projects, all construction projects. How many do you have? Probably thousands, right? Yeah, altogether. So 24 out of like 1,000 or more, that's a pretty small percentage of PODs. So we're really not looking at a lot of projects. We have 24 in Oklahoma, and you probably have 1,000 at least active projects going on in the state at any one time. Not necessarily just authorized this year, but actual active projects. That's how most states are, unless you're in California or Texas, one of the big states, and then they have thousands and thousands. So technical assistance, that's the one cool thing with Federal Highway is because we have an office in every state, we can provide technical assistance pretty much right there on the spot. And then if they can't offer that technical assistance, they can run it up to either the Resource Center, headquarters office, and we will provide it back down. Most of the time, you know, like if people call me from a state DOT, I usually say, hey, please go through the division office first because we like to keep the divisions in the loop. But if I do get contacted by a state, I will respond back to them, but I'll usually CC the division office, and most of the time I'll call them and let them and give them a heads up to know that the state contacted me, so they're just in the loop. Quality improvements and deployment of state-of-the-art technology, you know, that's where we basically initiate a lot of those EDC, Everyday Counts initiatives, comes, you know, from a national level down to the divisions, and then the divisions push it out to the states. So now, we're still in 23 USC 106, but now we're in paragraph G4. So this basically says, and I want to jump over to the green box first, because G4 talks about the state responsibilities. G2 and 3 basically say that Federal Highway Administration is responsible for ensuring that state DOTs have sufficient project delivery systems, sufficient financial systems, and sufficient methods for estimating costs. Then G4 basically says that the states have the same exact responsibilities for your subrecipients. So you guys provide funds to your MPOs. How many people have went out and said, hey MPO, can I see your financial system to see and make sure that your system can handle tracking the federal dollars the way it's supposed to? That is a state responsibility. And this is something that, you know, this has been out there for a long time, but we really haven't come up with really a method to do that other than our basic review programs. Fire reviews, compliance assessment reviews, those can test certain things. But I can say that coming out very soon, there's going to be a requirement for the division offices to go out and review and assess state systems, like a more formal process. And there is a requirement that state DOTs, you have to do that same exact thing for your local government. So are we saying that you have to be a system accountant expert? No, we're going to try to come up with some tools to help you. Really what we're trying to make sure is that anybody who is any entity that's managing federal dollars, that their systems are sufficient enough, that they have good internal controls, that they have separations of duties, that they can track their funds appropriately, like separate out direct costs from indirect costs, very simple things like that. We're not saying it has to be some big multi-million-dollar comprehensive financial system. It could be QuickBooks, it could be an Excel spreadsheet, but you know, it could be an Excel spreadsheet. I don't recommend that because it doesn't have good controls. But if that's all that they can do, then that's fine, but then they have to have extra controls to make sure that, you know, things don't get typed in incorrectly, or that there is a reconciliation done and good processes and procedures for how you do that. So this 106G4 is basically our law that says states are responsive to all areas relating to financial integrity and project delivery of your subrecipients, and that you have to ensure that they have adequate project delivery systems and sufficient accounting controls for proper management of the federal funds. Ultimately, we hold the state DOTs accountable for all federal dollars that go through. If you provide funds to an MPO and that MPO uses them improperly or has a improper payment, we do not go to the MPO and say, hey MPO, you have to pay back Federal Highway. We go back to ODOT and say, hey, we found an error in your MPO, we found an improper payment. ODOT, you have to pay us back, and then if you guys want to go collect from the MPO, that's up to you. And most of the time you will, but we never collect from the MPO, we always collect from the state. So that's what this slide's basically saying, is that the state is not relieved of the responsibility when it designates an LPA to manage a project or administer a project. We always hold the state accountable because you are our direct recipient. So if you do provide funds to a local government or to an MPO, you now become a pass-through entity. And there are very specific requirements in 2 CFR 200, and it's in 2 CFR 200.331 that outline what the subrecipient responsibilities are. So basically a pass-through entity definition, it's a non-federal entity that provides a subaward to a subrecipient to carry out a part of a federal program. So if you do provide funds to a local government, even an MPO, you should be having an agreement with that MPO or with that local government. And that agreement should outline all of the federal requirements and these very specific data elements. So you're going to see another slide that's similar to this in the next module, and the reason why we show it twice is because it's actually twice in 2 CFR 200. So this one is in 2 CFR 200.331 and is very specific to subawards. The one that you're going to see in the next module is very specific to federal awards, so that would be the agreement between Federal Highway and the state DOT. And the only difference on the other one is going to be it has one extra data element for budget, and what we consider that is your STIP amount. But back to the subaward, we need to have all of these things in your agreements with your MPOs. And for the most part, a lot of them are the same. So name, DUNS number, which is a very specific identification number for entities that do business with the federal government. You're required to have a DUNS number. The FAHN is the project number, the federal award project number. But let's look at the new ones. We have period of performance, start and end date. So we've always had a start date. That's always kind of been our authorization date. But now we have what's called an end date. And it has to be an end date for the phase of work that's currently authorized. So if we're talking a construction project and we're in the design phase, the end date is going to be when you think design is going to be done, not when you think construction is going to be done, because we haven't got to construction yet. It has to be authorization for design is your start date, and when do you think design is going to be done, and that's going to be your end date. And when we say it's done, we're talking the consultant has done all the design, or the state forces have done all the design, and you've done all those other administrative activities that your finance folks and other people might have to do after everything's done to close out that phase. So you have to think about everything that has to be done, not just the design work, but everything. Then when you're ready to move to the next phase, then you can modify that end date, because there's only one end date on every project. And let me just ask, in Oklahoma, do you put all of your phases of work on one federal project agreement, or do you have an individual project agreement for each phase of work in FEMAS? Individual? Okay. So you have a federal project number for a design project, and then when you're ready to move to right-of-way or construction, you have a completely new federal project number. Okay. So this might be a little easier for you because you just have a design project that you got to manage, and once that design is done, you should be closing that project out within 90 days of that end date, even if you're moving to construction. So that's the next question. Do you keep open your design while construction's going on just in case there's design changes? Because sometimes, and I'm not saying this is wrong, but some states will charge back to that PE for design changes in construction, and some states will actually charge it to, say, construction engineering or some other phase under the construction phase of work. So you just have to think about that, because if you're keeping the design project open in order to account for possible design changes as the project goes on, then that possibly could become an inactive project. So I'm saying if you do that, make sure you're monitoring those design projects pretty closely. And it's really up to how your system works. Do you know how it works?
We put 7 years based on majority of our design projects.
7-year.
We have like specific amount of time for specific projects.
Okay.
7 years is our general amount of time we put for
Okay. So your period of performance is usually 7 years.
ideally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds pretty standard.
So it all depends. Every project is special.
Yeah. And see, and that's a good thing, because you probably have, is every project 7 years, or do you say, okay, these easier ones might be 4 years?
Design, and then there's planning, there's the 3 or 4 years. It just depends. We have a standard amount of time and
Yeah.
formula we use for construction projects. But yeah, no, it's not 7 for everything. It's 7 or 3 or 4.
Okay.
Depending on what kind of project. And then construction, we base it on the authorization date plus a formula.
Yeah. So it sounds like you guys have a pretty good process. I've seen some states where they just like, okay, we're going to just tack on 10 years to PE because we have the 10-year PE rule. And it's like, you can't really say that every PE project is going to take 10 years. So yeah, it sounds like you guys have a good process, and that's good. So you have to identify that start and end date on every project. Then let's jump over to the CFDA number. Just as an FYI, they're doing it's out for public comment now, an update to 2 CFR 200, and they are taking away CFDA, the term, and now they're going to call it Federal Assistance Listing. Don't ask me why. We've been using CFDA for many, many years. I think people understand what it means, but now they're going to change the name of it. So now it's going to be called a Federal Assistance Listing, but it's basically the same exact thing. It's the 5-digit 20.205, 20.205 is the main Federal Assistance Listing number for Federal Highway Administration for our Highway Planning and Construction Program. But we also have some other ones, like Rec Trails has its own. I think it's 20.419. Then we have other ones for some special safety programs. But for the most part, depending on what federal dollars you're using, you should know what that Federal Assistance or CFDA number is, because we're expecting that you're going to track your expenditures by that number. So if you're using FTA funds and federal highway funds and you're expending them both at the same time, you should be tracking, okay, these are our expenditures for the FTA, CFDA, and these are the expenditures for our federal highway CFDA number or Federal Assistance Listing. So you have to be able to track by those. But this we're talking about is subawards. So we have to tell our subrecipients what that Federal Assistance Listing number is. Because if we don't tell the MPO, hey, you're spending MPO dollars and you have to track it by this number, then they're not going to do it correctly. So you have to put this into your agreements and let them know what that CFDA number is or the Federal Assistance Listing number. Then indirect cost rate for the federal award. That's not necessarily a new item. What's new about it is you have to put that rate in your agreement. So if you have an MPO that's claiming, say, 10% indirect cost, your agreement should show that. Your agreement should say you have a 10% indirect cost allocation plan rate. And you'll see up here on the next slide, you should also attach, like in the third bullet, a copy of the approved indirect cost allocation agreement that their federal awarding agency or that ODOT approved. That should be attached to support that number. Now, oftentimes that rate is only good for 1 year, and maybe a project's going to span 2 or 3 years with a local government. You might just have to get an update. You don't have to go out and do a whole new agreement, but you can just have them send you an update, and you can just put that in your project file that, hey, they have a new rate now this year, and it's now 12% instead of 10%. So you just have to document it. In addition to those, you need to also identify any of the other federal statutes or regulations. So now I'd like you to jump out to Appendix 5, where it talks about the subaward agreement. I'm sorry, it's Appendix 4. And it says suggested subaward agreement. So we're not saying that your agreement has to look exactly like this. All we're saying here is look at all of the different requirements, and some may be applicable to a project and some may not. It all depends on the project. But there are a lot of things that you have to consider and communicate to your LPAs or to your MPOs on what the federal rules are, because if we don't communicate it to them, they're not going to know what they have to do. And that's right back to that stewardship and oversight. Stewardship of the funds, we have to make sure that we're doing everything in compliance with the regulations. But if we're not telling the local governments what those are, then it's going to be more likely that they're going to do something that's not correct. So you can see, number 1, you're identifying who all the parties are. Number 2, those are those data elements that we just talked about. Now, once we get into 3 and 5, you can see there's kind of a mix and match of program requirements, so 23 USC or 23 CFR requirements, and also 2 CFR 200 requirements. So, like, I'm not going to read through all of these, but like in 3A, cost sharing and matching. So we have very specific requirements in our federal rules, in our law, in 23 USC 120 that talks about what the federal shares are for each one of our programs. Then 2 CFR 200 has a very specific section that talks about cost sharing and matching. So we all want to make sure that we're still in line with that. If we're doing any kind of unique matching, we need to make sure that we're documenting that. If it's not a straight, 80-20, like you guys use toll credits, you have to document that you're using toll credits and not cash, because it changes what that reimbursement's going to be. So if you have a $1,000 bill that comes in and you're using toll credits, you submit the whole bill for $1,000 and we reimburse you $1,000. And your toll credits are used to say that yes, you met the match, which is 20%. If you're using cash and it's a $1,000 bill, you're only going to submit a reimbursement to Federal Highway for $800, and the $200 is going to be paid for with state dollars. So that's the big difference on toll credits, and you need to make sure that you're documenting that in your agreements. If you jump over to the program requirements in number 5, you can see, and this all depends on what phase of work we're in. So if we're not, like A applies to all projects. That's the agreement provisions for Federal Highway. It outlines that when we authorize a project, you have to choose, are you going to use a pro rata or are you going to use a lump sum? And you have to stick with whatever you choose once we've authorized it. And the difference between a pro rata and a lump sum is pro rata 80-20. Even if you're using toll credits, you're 80-20. A lump sum, it says you're going to get $1 million, and it's still going to be at the 80-20, but if there was cost overruns, you're not going to get any more than $1 million of federal funds. So you're limiting the amount of federal dollars are going to be on the project. That would be considered a lump sum. So most all projects are pro rata. A lot of local projects sometimes are lump sum, but whatever you pick, you have to stick with once we've authorized it. That's what the agreement provisions talk about. But then, like if you're only in design and you're not ready to go into construction or right-of-way, maybe you don't need to do anything with environment yet. Oftentimes, though, in design, you're evaluating environmental concerns, and that kind of feeds into your NEPA determination. But 23 CFR 771 really is when you're getting to that point of making that NEPA determination. That's when you have to follow that. Contracting, 23 CFR Part 635 Subpart A, you're not going to follow that unless you're in construction. So it's all going to depend on what the project is, what activities you're doing, on what you're going to communicate to the local governments. But basically, this just gives you an idea that there are a lot of different things that have to go into your subaward agreements and that you should be communicating to your LPAs and your MPOs. So then we have our pre-award understandings, post-award actions. So after the award, what do they have to do? This is where we talk about those financial management standards. What do financial systems have to be able to do? How do we close out a project? This is where we talk about maybe the end date. So when you award your funds to an MPO, what is their end date? Because most MPO projects are those work programs, like UPWP work programs? Or what kind of projects do you award to MPOs? Because you guys said that you do do subawards to MPOs. What are those projects? Yeah, so they have like a unified work program, right? Like an annual work program. So is it an annual, or do you have to do it every 2 years? Annual. Okay. So on those projects, your end date is going to be dependent on what ODOT has to do to close out the project, right? So your period of performance might be a start date of, are you on a June to a July fiscal year? Okay. Yeah, but the MPOs, they go on the state fiscal year. So is their work program, let's say that it starts on June 1st, and they say it ends on July 31st. That might be their end date, but the state DOT, you all still have to close out that project in FEMA. You all still may have to review the costs that are coming in. So your period of performance on an annual project like that could be not just a year, but it could be a year and 6 months. It could be 2 years. And I'm not sure if when you did your analysis on period of performance, if you figured in that. Do you guys know what your period of performance is for, say, annual projects like a UPWP for an MPO? That might be something that you want to look at. Hey, what are we putting on our MPO projects for period of performance? Because if you're pushing that date, that end date, that's where it gets a little bit tricky, because you could possibly incur costs after that end date, and then they're going to be unallowable. You may have to ask for a lot of extensions if you're not putting in or accounting for enough time to finish up a project. So those are kind of things that you have to think about. So that's just to give you an idea of all the different requirements that you have to kind of consider when you're doing agreements with local governments, because we have to communicate what those requirements are in order to expect them to do what they're supposed to be doing. The other big thing is, and I haven't seen this too much with locals, I've seen it with tribes, where they don't want to open up their records. They don't want auditors coming in and looking at their stuff. Well, if you're using federal dollars, you have to make sure that the locals or whoever's receiving the federal dollars, they have to open their records. They have to be open for public review. They have to be accessible by the federal awarding agency, by ODOT, by auditors. So you have to just make sure you're telling them that if they're going to use federal dollars, they have to be able to allow people to look at their records. And then what are the terms and conditions to close out the award, the subaward? What are the expectations that that local government has to do in order to close it out and have it be completed? So like we said earlier, we can't look at every single project and every single detail of every single project. So you have to do a risk assessment. And really in 2 CFR 200, it's a little bit more wordy than this slide, but not much. It doesn't really go into a whole lot of detail of what your risk assessment should look like. But it does say, what are the things that we look at to make sure that we're assessing or evaluating that risk? So if you have a brand new MPO, let's say it's a brand new MPO, they've just been classified as an MPO because they went over the TMA population area. And they've established this new MPO, they've never received any funds, they're probably going to be higher risk than some of your, like Oklahoma City MPO. They've been around for a while, they know what they're doing, so most likely that newer MPO is going to be a higher risk. We're not saying they're going to do something wrong, but there's a more likelihood of them doing something incorrect because of their lack of experience. So that might be one thing that you address. Audits, Oklahoma City. If your MPO in Oklahoma City has findings, even if they're very experienced, it might make them higher risk if they have a lot of findings. So we might have to do a little bit more oversight on them. These are all just examples. Results of previous audits or single audits. New personnel. So if you get your MPO turns over all of its staff because of retirements or whatever, and you have a bunch of new staff, it's almost like having a new MPO. We're not saying that the staff's going to do something wrong, but it's going to raise them on the risk a little bit. You might want to focus more of your efforts and your resources on looking at them instead of other MPOs. And then any results that we might find, the Federal Highway Administration, we might go out and do a planning review or an MPO review, and we find some issues. That's going to probably result in us saying, hey, ODOT, you might need to look at this MPO a little bit more, and that's going to use up some of your resources, and it's also going to raise the risk on that MPO. So you just have to look at everything and kind of balance where you want to put your resources, because nobody has enough resources to do full-blown look at every single detail on every single project. So once you've done that risk assessment, now what are the activities that you're going to do to monitor to make sure everything's working out the way it's supposed to? Must review financial and performance reports. So a lot of times in planning, you guys you get reports that we have to review, So we might want to look at those things. If you're saying that they're going to do a survey or they're going to do an assessment, then we should see some documentation after that's done that says, yes, they got it done. If there are audit findings, and I mentioned this earlier, ODOT, you're responsible for following up on any findings related to Federal Highway Program funds. So if your MPO has an audit that says, there was internal control issues and there was an improper payment made, ODOT, you're responsible for saying, okay, MPO, we agree with what the auditor says, and this is what your corrective action is, and this is what we'd like to see, and they should be responding back to you, and you may have to go back out and do another check to make sure everything works out. And then there's something called a management decision, which is a very formal letter or correspondence that addresses that deficiency, and you have to complete those as well. And we'll talk about those when we get into Subpart F. Technical and training and assistance. You guys don't have a big LPA program here, but I know in Nebraska and Wyoming, several other states, if a local public agency wants federal dollars, they have to be certified. So the state actually has an LPA certification program where Nebraska is pretty extreme. It's like 2 weeks where they have to come in and do 2 weeks of training, which is pretty hard for LPAs. When I was in Wyoming, they had a 3-day one. They did a 3-day training. They required that LPA to come in, take that class, and then they were certified. But if that individual who took the class leaves that LPA, then there's a requirement that they have to get recertified. That LPA has to get recertified. But it covers like the training. It covers all the requirements that an LPA needs to understand. And so while I show you the subaward agreement, it doesn't necessarily have to be an agreement. It could be an LPA manual that you have that outlines all the different requirements. It could be a certification program. It could be a lot of different things. But you should be communicating a lot of the stuff in your agreements that's going to change based on or is going to be unique to a project. So any questions on any of the stewardship and oversight stuff? Okay, one other big thing, and this, I'm not sure if you guys are doing this, is you should be going out and checking to make sure that your MPOs did get an audit if they're required to. That's another responsibility of ODOT. So there's a place called the Federal Audit Clearinghouse that you can go out and look them up, and you can pretty much find anything out there, and the link is in the back of your book. It's a really weird census.gov link, so I don't ever remember it, but I did put it in the back of the book, and you can go out and do lookups. And you can really look at anything. You could look up pretty much any state, any entity that was required to get an audit, they should have one out there. Yes? Yeah, it could be a CPA firm. As long as there's not findings. So basically the process is going to be if they spend more than $750,000, so expend more than $750,000 in total federal dollars in 1 year, in their fiscal year, they're required to get a single audit. So if they're required to get a single audit, they'll go out and hire a CPA firm to come in and do it. There's deadlines. They have to get a single audit done and completed within 9 months after the end of their fiscal year. And if that auditor found issues and there's actual true findings, then the ODOT is responsible for following up on those findings. If there was no findings, the responsibility is they have to upload the audit to the Federal Audit Clearinghouse to show that they got one done. But if there's no findings, you're right. We say, hey, they did the audit, there was no findings, and then we move on. We don't have to worry about it. It's really if they have findings where there's a lot more work to do and you have to follow up and you have to make sure that they have a good corrective action. Oftentimes we see audit findings crossing over into the next fiscal year, so it shows up twice on their audit. So then we really need to make sure that they get those things cleared up. But yeah, if there's no findings, once they've uploaded and got the audit done, then that's it. But we're going to talk tomorrow when we get into Subpart F that we want to have a quality audit though. So we don't want to go out and get the cheapest audit that we can find because it may not be sufficient, or get an audit from somebody who maybe doesn't have experience doing governmental auditing. Maybe they have experience doing private auditing, for-profit auditing, but governmental auditing is quite a bit different. There's a lot of different rules they have to follow. It's a completely different thing. So we'll get into more details on the audit side, but yeah, the only time you have to do a lot of extra work is if there's actual findings. I would say, yeah, I would say that it should be a CPA firm, or what a lot of states do is your state auditor Your state auditor's office does a lot of the single audits for, say, state government. But locals and MPOs, they have to go out and get it should be a CPA firm. It should be a firm that's experienced in actually doing audits. It can't just be any Joe Schmo off the street. Okay, oh, and then down there, that third bullet. If we find, and there'll be a slide on here later that kind of shows what some of these enforcement actions are, but basically if we find any issues, then we can implement, and so can ODOT, any of these non-compliant enforcement actions. And they could be as simple as temporarily withholding approval on a project until they fix something, whatever that is, or if there's true fraud, waste, and abuse, which we don't see very often, but if there is, it also says we can do suspension and debarment, which basically bans that contractor or consultant from ever doing business with the federal government until they fix things. So it could be from one extreme to another, and it all depends on whatever the compliance issue is. Most of the time, you know, people aren't purposefully trying to be non-compliant, so it could just be, hey, let's fix whatever the issue is, and then we'll continue on business as usual. Okay. So let's do a Kahoot, and then we'll take a break. Ready this time. Still trying to get in. What? Except for we're slowly losing players because we started with 32 and then we had 29 and we have 25. Okay, here we go. Okay, there's only 3 questions on this one. So what section of 23 USC are the state responsibilities identified? Yeah, 23 USC 106. Remember we had 106 paragraph C and then G. All right, on the beach, the wizard, Monkey Man, Simon Cody, and Smiley Face. Okay, good one. Number 2, state DOTs cannot assume responsibilities to act on behalf of federal highway. Yeah. You can assume, and we actually expect you to assume based on our stewardship and oversight agreement. And the states have assumed a lot more than it used to be in the past. Ooh, Money Man moved up. Sitting on the beach went down 1. Simon Cody, still got the same folks, Smiley Face and the Wizard. And then up 13 places is the Thinker. I think that's a thinker. What section of 2 CFR 200 describes pass-through entity responsibility? Yeah, so 2 CFR 200, 331. 331 talks about the pass-through entity responsibilities. All right, and who are our winners? Number 3, the wizard. Number 2, happy smiley face. Ooh, on the beach. Good job. Okay,